Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 historically interesting, but musically totally irrelevant pre-LP conductors. This talk may ruffle a few feathers, but it really is consistent with my contention that there are very few performances of anything that were recorded in the pre-LP era, that is 78's acoustic recording, early electrical recordings, that weren't surpassed later in glamorous stereo or even glamorous mono in the mid-50s or somewhere around there. You name any work and I can probably show you a better performance of it, especially if it's an orchestral piece. We're talking about conductors and orchestral works. I make exceptions for opera singers and pianists and violinists. I do, because solos were recorded better. You could hear them better. You could hear what they were doing better. And there's also more individuality in the performance than you usually find with conductors. Usually, not always. And we'll get to that in a moment. So let's talk about the list. First, Felix Weingartner. Oh my gosh, wasn't he uninteresting? Weingartner was a very famous conductor. He succeeded Mahler, I think, in the Vienna Phil or the opera or whatever. I mean, major guy. And he made a lot of recordings, especially in like the 20s, especially in London. Here's the thing. I remember when the Weingartner edition was re-released on EMI. Japanese EMI is very expensive and a whole slew of things. And I went and I listened to them and I bought them and I was all excited and I put them on and I was like, as an interpreter, Weingartner was one of those, he was kind of like Bruno Walter without the charm. He was a conductor of sort of straightforward. He wasn't a crazy romantic. He was by the book, and he just didn't do anything that other people didn't do better, in much better sound. And of course, the orchestras in those days weren't so hot either. So, yeah. I got rid of them all eventually. I listened to them and said, I've got to get myself into this. Nah. Glad I did it. I'm glad I learned what I learned. But boy, don't waste your time. So that's Weingartner. Actually, as a composer, he's more interesting than he was as a conductor. And he wasn't that interesting as a composer either. But it's all relative. Next, Arthur Nikisch. Well, Nikisch was unquestionably one of the most famous conductors of his day. He had the Berlin Philharmonic, and he recorded only like 2 or 3 things. There's like a Weber Overture, but there's that Berlin Beethoven Fifth, the acoustic one. It was like DG's first recording or something. You could barely hear what's going on. And everybody screams and yells about it because it's historically very important. Like I said, some of these things are historically significant. But are they musically significant? You can't tell a damn thing from that recording of the Beethoven that matters. You get tempo. That's all you get. Nothing else. It's a waste of time, a total waste of time. You may want to hear it just because, well, isn't it fascinating to hear what an orchestra sounded like in like 1905 or I don't know, whatever year it was. But once you've done it, there's no reason to do it again. Absolutely none whatsoever. Next, Richard Strauss. Now, this is interesting. I did the list of composers who were also conductors and whatnot. Richard Strauss was, in his day, acclaimed as a conductor. He had the mining and court orchestra after Hans von Bülow. So, that's major stuff. But all of his recordings are dreadful. He probably didn't like making recordings. That's another issue, too. But, he recorded some Beethoven. He said conducting his own music bored him. And you can tell. It's boring. There are videos of him conducting. He's like this. He just sits there with no expression whatsoever on his face, paying seemingly no attention to what's going on. He wrote tips for conductors. He was really well known. But none of that is evident from his recordings. It's not that they're horrible. They're just not interesting. And God knows we have great Strauss. Was he a Kempe? No. Why would you listen to Strauss himself when you can listen to Kempe? The composer is not always the last word in their own music, especially if they can't play it or don't like to play it, as in this case. So Richard Strauss. Next, Henry Wood. Remember Henry? Good old Henry. Henry Wood was another splendid conductor. He founded the London Proms, the proms, the promenade concerts. He had all kinds of things dedicated to him. Vaughan Williams' Serenade to Music was dedicated to him. He was supposedly a terrific guy. I believe it. But, he commissioned his own, or did his own, by the way, pictures at an exhibition, but then heard Ravel's and retired his. He made those arrangements of Handel's water music and fireworks music that are still performed. An important guy, very important in the musical life of the UK. Not important on disc. There isn't anything he recorded, basically, that we can't hear in, first of all, infinitely better sound and in performances that are easily as compelling, very easily, extremely easily, unbelievably easily. So after Henry Wood, Oskar Fried. Well, nobody really cares about Oskar Fried except that he recorded the first Mahler Second Symphony. And it's very quick, and half of the orchestral texture is missing. And for some reason, people worship it for that reason. One of the things about historical recordings is what I call the imaginative recreation syndrome. Because in orchestral music, particularly, so much of the texture and timbre is simply missing, people hear these recordings and they imaginatively supply what isn't there. And then they give credit to the conductor for having done what isn't there. In other words, they're delusional. A lot of historical recording fans, they really are delusional, and they're talking about things that simply aren't there, or making a big deal out of things that are so much better done elsewhere. It's a thing, and it's a cult. It's a cult. We've talked about lots of cults, and so that's a cult, and especially when it comes to conductors, it's just like. So Oskar Fried has that horrible Mahler 2 and a few other things, and none of it matters. None, zero, zippo. Forget it. Serge Koussevitzky. This is going to be interesting because supposedly there's a big Koussevitzky box coming. So we're all going to have a chance to reassess this, to reassess his work in Boston. One of the most important conductors of the 20th century, because he married a very rich lady and commissioned all kinds of stuff and did all kinds of modern music and promoted. I mean, he was such an important person in the musical world. He was a mentor to Leonard Bernstein, but his own recordings, I've been listening, and so few of them seem to hold up. It's really shocking. And I mean, the jury's out. I won't dismiss him unilaterally, but I really want to hear, with fresh ears and in new remasterings, as much of his stuff as I can, because I've been so disappointed by what's been available, and particularly how well it's been preserved and recorded. So Koussevitzky is, unfortunately, not exciting. It's not looking great, but you never know. Next, Albert Coates. Yes, remember Albert Coates? Albert Coates was actually born in Russia, although he was British. I liked listening to his recordings because he did everything faster than anyone in the human race ever could. I mean, you should have heard his Mozart Jupiter Symphony. Wow, it was amazing. Was it musical? No. Do you need to hear it again? No, of course not. I mean, but it's a party record. It was kind of fun. That's worth looking out for. Then Willem Mengelberg. Someone said recently when I did cult conductors, what about the Mengelberg cult? Well, I don't care about, Mengelberg is famous because, well, again, historically very important. He essentially put the Concertgebouw Orchestra on the map, and because of his association with Mahler. And he recorded this bizarre Mahler 4 where the tempos are all over the place, and people somehow think that that's authentic. Or that may have been what he did when he had that fabulous concert where he played it once and then Mahler played it again at the same concert. They did it twice and they listened to each other's interpretations. I wish I could have been there. But the fact of the matter is that Mengelberg began life fairly normally. And then as he got older, he got weirder and started monkeying with the scores and changing tempos and futzing around and doing all of this crap. And there's no evidence that what he did with Mahler 4 is any more demented than what he did with Beethoven later on and everything else he did. And it is demented, but the sound of his recordings was always dreadful. And, he was a Nazi sympathizer and he got the boot after World War II and ended his life in disgrace. And so there is this A lot of the Mengelberg cult is this attempt to rehabilitate him. But we don't need to rehabilitate him because he wasn't that interesting. He was bizarre. There are plenty of bizarre people. If I want bizarre, I'll listen to Hermann Scherchen. He's bizarre and he's fun and he's usually in better sound. I mean, Golovanov, he's also in terrible sound, but he's even more bizarre than Mengelberg. There are other people we could be talking about aside from Mengelberg, but he's got, of course, a huge nationalistic following in the Netherlands. I mean, you have to ignore the Dutch people in order to really sort of get a sense of Mengelberg's importance. I mean, I have all of his recordings. I do. And I've listened to them very carefully. There's a St. Matthew Passion that some people swear by, although it's heavily cut. We can do better in all of that music. We can do better, even though he had certain qualities that were admittedly unique. I grant him that. But importantly unique, musically, rewardingly unique, not once you've heard it. When you hear somebody do something ridiculous the first time, there's almost no reason to go hear it again because they did it. And then you move on to good performances, right? So, forget Mengelberg. Oh yeah, here are a couple more to wrap up. Hans Pfitzner. Pfitzner made records. Yes, he did. He did mostly Beethoven, like German symphonies and things. Dreadfully boring, uninteresting performances by a boring, uninteresting composer who wrote lots of boring, uninteresting music. What were we really expecting? That he was suddenly going to come alive and galvanize us in dreadful acoustic or early electrical sound? No, he didn't. There were lots of sort of, third-rate German conductors, Kapellmeister types who made records in the early days, usually with like the Berlin State Opera Orchestra or one of these bands that had nothing better to do with its time. And they're just not very interesting or exciting. They sound bad. They're creaky. They may give us some sense of performance practice at the time, but the same performance practice was still happening 50 years later. So, I mean, what's the point? And last but not least, Leo Blech. I love Leo Blech. He was the cousin of Franz Yuck, and he was married to Hingelborg Fe. Yes, exactly. Now Blech was a not terribly interesting German conductor who actually lived into the LP era, but I don't think he made any LPs. I'm not sure. He was another run-of-the-mill German guy who did some Wagner things and whatnot, and so people like to cite them as evidence of the incredible tradition of Wagner performance or whatever, of Blech performance of Blechy stuff, and it's Blech. I mean, the name tells you all you need to know about the performances in question. So we don't need to make too much of a big deal about this list. In other words, we could go on. There are more. There are more by people whose supposed reputations are nowhere supported by the recordings that they actually made. But we don't need to. You get the point, right? As I said, there is no reason to make yourself crazy over historical recordings 99% of the time when you can do better with better sounding recent things. And I know there are always exceptions. Weingartner did make one or two really good recordings. All of these people, except for Nikisch, who was too early, did good work. It's not that they didn't do good work. It's that you can have better work. And if you need to decide how to allocate your time and attention and money, although most of this stuff is now on YouTube, you can hear it for nothing, and if you're interested in finding the best work, you're not going to deal with these folks. You're just not. It may be a phase. You may have to go through it, So get it over with and move on to better things. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.